First of all, the slave trade was an enforced migration. Sometimes slavery isn't thought of in terms of migration, immigration, people leaving countries and moving to other places. So many countries in the world are peopled by immigrants who come from elsewhere. What distinguishes the transatlantic slave trade was the importance of violence and the fact that it was forced. In fact, it was the largest enforced migration in the history of the world. And it was the earliest large-scale migration of the modern world. And that's one of the reasons why we study it so carefully. And what it meant at the time, because of the violence and because of the enslavement, and because people were being moved against their will and to places where they didn't want to go and didn't even know about, was that this enforced migration has become so identified with slavery as an institution that sometimes it's easy to forget that what was involved was actually the movement of people. And because of the way people were enslaved through violence, through war, through kidnapping, that dimension of the whole migration, of enforced movement, means that sometimes we lose sight of the fact that the people that were actually in this situation were individuals and were not just some commodity that was being bought and sold by merchants. And that means that a lot of the violence and a lot of the warfare that resulted in the enslavement of people affected civilian populations, affected populations that were not necessarily committed to the wars or to the actions that had resulted in their enslavement. And it's this high level of casualties among civilians, among people who were not involved directly in war, that makes the slave trade so vicious and so terrible in the lives of people. And when we look at specific individuals, as in this drawing by Debray that was done in Brazil in the 1840s, what we're seeing is we're seeing individuals, in this case a number of women, all of whom were born in Africa and all of whom ended up in slavery in Brazil. And despite the way they're dressed in this particular slide, they were often bruised, they were mistreated, and they were kept in complete poverty. These images are actually images that come at the time of Carnival, when people dressed up for the celebrations. So it looks rosier than it is. Or this young boy also dressed up for Carnival, who came from Mozambique in southeastern Africa, and therefore in some ways was a bit unusual in that he didn't come from the western part of Africa. But again, when you look at even this drawing of him, you see is a real live person, an individual who doesn't look like some stereotype image. And in his particular case, the area that he came from was very heavily into using tattoos on the face and body as to some extent for beautification purposes, but often also related to certain rituals and certain practices that were recognized locally and therefore helped in identification of people. Or in this individual, very famous man, Gustavus Vassa, who's more often known by his birth name, Wolata Equiano, came from what's now Nigeria. He was a very important abolitionist in Britain at the end of the 18th century. And as you can see here, he's dressed very much as if he was a British gentleman, something that he actually aspired to later in his life. He was literate, he was a political activist, very left-wing, and was one of the leaders in the campaign to end the slave trade. But by origin, he was Igbo. He came from what's now Nigeria, and we will hear much more about him later in this course. Or these three individuals, all Muslims who came from what's now northern Nigeria and neighboring Niger, showing their facial but not their body markings, which were related to their identity in terms of where their parents came from, their occupations, and the cities they lived in. Or this individual, Muhammad Gardo Bakwakwa, who we will also hear more about, who was enslaved in 1845 in the interior of what's now the modern Republic of Benin. And he was taken to Brazil in 1845. He was taken to New York City in 1847 by his master, who was trading in coffee. And when he was in New York, he escaped from slavery and subsequently wrote his autobiography in Chatham, Ontario. Or four more individuals, also from the drawings of Rugandas, who also captures, for me, he captures the individuality of the different people who were involved in slavery, and again highlights the point that these people were more than just victims, they were more than just people who suffered slavery. They were really individuals who had their own personal lives and somehow did the best they could in conditions of slavery. The next few slides really focus in on one particular part of West Africa. This is what's southern Nigeria, all the way over to what's now Ghana, with Cameroon very much there on the east, and showing the different ethnic groups and showing various important towns in the 19th century, in the period before 1836, and showing the area that people who subsequently were known as, and who we know today as, Yoruba. And it shows the areas from which people who were Yoruba speaking came from. And they went heavily to Cuba, and they went heavily to northeastern Brazil. This shows the modern boundaries of Ghana, Togo, Benin, and Nigeria, about the same general area of Yoruba culture and neighboring cultures, showing the importance of the river system that flows into the ocean. And yet another slide that shows another feature of this part of West Africa, which is the lagoon system. Behind the beach that along the ocean, there was a series of lagoons which were actually used extensively for navigation locally. One of the women that comes from this area, which because she's not wearing a top, you can actually see that their body markings go all the way down to her navel. And this slide and the next slide showing specific patterns of facial markings that were peculiar to the Yoruba-speaking people. And you can see that they're very distinct marks. And anybody who was Yoruba would have known the significance of the differences in the scarification. And here you see ones that are associated with Oyo, some associated with Egba, some associated with Ife, Alicia, and other parts of Yoruba land, Ondo, and so on. And those scarifications and those identifications with different parts of Yoruba land was very closely connected with religious observances. Among the Yoruba, as we will see even more later in the course, were closely associated with the worship of different gods, which were known as Orisha. This is one of the Orisha, Ogun, which is associated with one of the rivers in Yoruba land. And this is a statue that's a representation of Ogun, the Orisha. And this particular statue comes from Haiti because a lot of the worship of Orisha was taken to Cuba, to Haiti, to Brazil, and the names of the gods remained the same, and many of the features and the worship remained the same, whether it was in diaspora or whether it was back in Africa. This showing a priestess who's associated with the god Ogun, and she's in a state of possession while there's music being played, and she is possessed by the god Ogun. And the types of ritualized membership in these religions that were associated with the Orisha involved elaborate rituals and in initiations. Individuals had to go through a learning process of what it meant to be associated with a particular god, and what obligations the individual had, or what taboos, what foods they could eat and not eat, and in effect the whole history and lore connected with each individual god. And you can see that the body markings and the ritualized wearing of a mask on the top of the head are all related to the worship. And in all cases, the worship of Orisha that involved the construction and maintenance of shrines. This is an Osha Ifa shrine from Cuba. Osha is the Spanish way of spelling Orisha. Ifa is one of the gods, is actually a god of divination. And this shrine consists of various objects, and there will be many different types of things that are in the objects. And in the lower left-hand corner, you can see part of an axe, which is often connected with yet another one of the Orisha by the name of Shango. Here's another shrine that's outside in the corner, again with various sticks and various stones and various objects that are all ritualized and all part of the shrine that depends on certain types of divination to decide what needs to be there and so on. Just so that you get a sense too of the types of people that were involved at the time, this is one of the most important of the slave traders that was on this part of the coast, Joaquim de Souza, whose father Felix de Souza was even more prominent. Over a stretch of 3 generations, this family dominated much of the slave trade from the African side on the stretch of coast that's now where Yoruba and Dahomey were located, and where there was such a major source of slaves for the Americas. In this case, in the case of the de Souza family, they were actually Brazilian by origin, Brazilian of mixed race, people who had gone back to West Africa and had become involved in the slave trade, even though their ancestors themselves had once been slaves. Or this very important Yoruba leader, Samuel Ajayi Crowther, who was the first Anglican bishop who was an African, and who had been enslaved as a boy and had been taken to Sierra Leone, and then subsequently was very much involved in what's now Nigeria in terms of establishing Christian missions and in terms of fighting the slave trade. In the next few slides, I want to shift from a focus that was really on the Yoruba area to an area further north, which was a region in which Islam was prominent for more than 1,000 years, well before the transatlantic slave trade, and therefore very important to the history of Africa from other perspectives. And here you see a part of the city of Timbuktu, and you see the very important mosque, the Sankore Mosque, which still exists and still looks exactly like that today. In the case of Islam, these large mosques were also universities. They were schools, and so that they were places of prayer and worship, but they were also places of learning. And the Sankore Mosque has served as a university, in effect, in Timbuktu for more than 500 years. And in the 19th century, the area that's now Nigeria and neighboring countries was part of a very large Muslim state that we'll look at in greater detail, that was known after its capital, Sokoto, and was referred to as a caliphate, so it was known as the Sokoto Caliphate. This is a drawing from the middle of the 19th century of the largest city in the Sokoto Caliphate, the city of Kano, which today is a city of about 4 million people. At the time this drawing was made, it was a city of about 50,000 people. Showing the walls of Kano City. The walls had gates in them, but they were meant to protect the city from raids by enemies who were on horseback. This is they were made out of mud brick, and they had to be repaired every year because the rains would partially destroy the walls, and they had to be maintained. This is the mosque that was in Kano, the historic mosque that was actually unfortunately torn down in the late 1920s by the emir of Kano at that time, who wanted a modern mosque, but this is the historic one that goes back for centuries. This is another central mosque. It's in Porto Novo, which is actually considered to be modeled on a Brazilian style because of the different colors, and because in some ways the central part of it looks like a Catholic church a bit. But you see that it's actually the minarets and everything, that it is a mosque.